Talks to change the Constitution have been around for many administrations now. Will there be progress this time around? Constitutionalist Attorney Edwin Lacierda weighs in. Thank you so much for joining us, Edwin. Why all this talk again of amending the Constitution, administration after administration, but nothing has happened? Why should it succeed now?
Well, number one, it's really very complicated right now. And especially you have two chambers proposing different solutions, different initiatives. One in the lower house. It's also a question of what's the fastest way to do it. And both chambers propose using people's initiative as a vehicle to amend constitutions. But to my recollection, Republic Act number 6735, the Initiative and Referendum Act, was declared inadequate by the Supreme Court as a legal framework to amend the Constitution. So I am not sure what they're talking about on a people's initiative. No? I'm aware of the fact that in 2018, Senator Coco Pimentel proposed a amendment to that particular law because of the inadequacy as declared by the Supreme Court. But I have not seen any movement towards that, or to my recollection, there was no new law that amended the RA number 6735. So I'm not sure what they're referring to as a people's initiative being a vehicle to amend the Constitution. Number two, the proposal of Senator Robin Padilla is quite radical in the sense, although it's not new, by the way. I recall that was introduced during the time of President Duterte, where you have regional senators. But the problem there is we already have 24 independent republics. We normally call the 24 senators as 24 independent republics. And they're supposed to guard the national interest. And you have the congressmen providing and protecting the local interests of each district. Will that be, would increasing to 54 senators a good deed? I seriously doubt it. We have, as of now, you already have 24 senators. They couldn't get along. How much more 54 senators?
So, Edwin,
it's becoming more complicated.
Edwin, you know, this 1987 Constitution was formed by constitutionalists to avoid another dictatorship, like the Marcos dictatorship. But is it now outdated? Does it really have to be amended to level up to the times?
The one thing good about a one-term, and here's the benefit of having a single-term president, is that it allows the younger generation to rise up through the political ranks. And the problem with the Marcos dictatorship during the 70s was that a whole generation was wiped out and there was no training ground for new leaders to rise up. In what we have right now, you have a consistent flow of new leaders rising up, and there's a vent for it's like a vent where people can, political leaders can express and exhibit their qualities as a leader. The downside to it, however, is there is no continuity, especially if the successor does not belong or does not adhere to the same political or economic philosophy of the predecessor. That's where the downside is. But in our case, I believe that we have done well, good enough. Like the problem there, during our time with President Aquino, there was also a huge effort by some members of our cabinet also, in addition to some members of the legislature, to amend the Constitution. But the late President Aquino would always say two things. Do we really need to amend the Constitution? What foreign investors would like, at least on the economic provision side, was there are two general principles that one should always adhere to: predictability of our rules and a level playing field. If you are able to establish this convincingly to the foreign investors, foreign investment will come in. The other issue was on the issue of land ownership. But the President Aquino would always mention the People's Republic of China. They don't allow their foreign ownership of land, and yet they flourish. So there are reasons why you don't necessarily have to immediately take out or amend the Constitution as the panacea to all the what we feel are the problems right now governing this country.
Well, because Edwin, many lawmakers in the lower house are saying easing restrictive provisions on economic ownership. Of course, you already had amended the Foreign Liberalization Act. You already had the Retail Liberalization Act. I mean, a lot of investment laws have already been amended. Isn't this sufficient? Why do we still have to tinker by amending the Constitution, which could be basically used to extend term limits?
I agree with you there, Rico. There are a number of workarounds that we've done. Like you mentioned, the Foreign Liberalization Act. We've also have foreign investments negative list where we reserve some businesses for our nationals. We have already opened up the business and we continue to do that. The problem, however, with us is the ebb and flow of political leadership. It's not so much our economic provision. We have good laws that if we, and also, by the way, we have a law, the ARTA, the Anti-Red Tape Act, that should also be implemented fully. And I believe that we can remedy all these concerns about economic progress by having an effective leadership and also proposing new laws. The laws that we have right now are good and are sufficient, and we can add some more laws. By the way, on the natural resources, where I believe one of the legislators would like to open up our natural resources to foreign nationals. It's going to be a national security issue, not just an economic issue. So we already have our power being controlled by foreign nationals, and we have a large outcry on that. Imagine our natural resources being controlled also by foreigners. We have a workaround on that point. We have what we call offtake agreements that are being done by foreign nationals who are investing here on on our natural resources.
All right. So the key here is basically Edwin, is to really maximize the laws that we already have in existence and use the political will of the president to be able to implement them. But of course, there's a lot of talk right now, right? Especially in the lower house. And they're already exploring options that does not involve the Senate, where previous charter change proposals languish. Is this possible without the consent of the Senate?
Under the Constitution, the problem with our 1987 Constitution was our framers, our 1986 constitutional commissioners, originally proposed a unicameral legislature. However, along the way, they've decided to shift from a one-chamber legislature to a bicameral legislature. Unfortunately, in that particular provision on amendments and revisions, they failed to amend it likewise as to make it voting separately. That's why in the issue on the amendments by way of Constituent Assembly, there's a provision which says 3/4 of all its members. So the House takes a position that 3/4 of all its members would mean all the members of the House and Senate voting jointly. The Senate takes a different approach because it's a bicameral legislature and supported, by the way, by our constitutional commissioners who framed the Constitution. They believe that provision applies to 3/4 of all its members voting separately. That's where the crux of the problem is. And that's where the Speaker Romualdez mentioned that they're going to go through a process of people's initiative to specifically address that issue on whether should it be voting jointly or separately. Obviously, they know that with the whole the two chambers voting jointly, they have the numbers. And that's why they want it codified. But it's going to be very expensive because once after you do that, assuming Speaker Romualdez and the lower house wins that argument and the people would vote on one voting jointly, then they have to create the Constituent Assembly. You imagine a two-step process. The People's Initiative first to resolve that process issue, and then you move to Constituent Assembly to now propose the necessary constitutional amendments. So that's going to be expensive. And by the way, Rico, the only reason why they're doing it right now is normally you do amendments while the mandate of the president is still high. I mean, by all accounts, the mandate of the president, although it has lowered a bit, it's still high in the 60s. So it's now's the best time to re-amend the Constitution under the belief that kaya ito, may mandato ng presidente, popular siya sa tao, kaya isusog na natin itong amendahan ng Constitution. That's the philosophy there. After midterms, it's going to be difficult because there's 3 more years before the president becomes a lame duck president.
All right. Thank you so much for insights. Costly, expensive, and using taxpayers' money. Constitutionalist Edwin Lacierda, thank you so much for joining us.